Welcome to another episode of Spirit-Anointed Leadership. So blessed to have you with us today. So excited about the things we're going to talk about because today is going to be really, really practical. Now, let me just say this. There's a sense in which I hope that this podcast is extremely helpful for you when you need it. I also kind of hope that you don't ever need it. We're going to talk about how does a church navigate effectively a crisis? How do we go through that in a way that actually helps the situation and doesn't make it worse? Can I just be really honest with you? Today's episode, as we talk about churches going through crisis, is not the kind of thing that we woke up today on a Monday and said, yes, I want to think about that. What I find is that so many churches never think about a crisis until they're in the midst of one. And then they wish that they would have done some pre-planning, and they wish they would have done something to prepare for themselves and for their church when they get in a crisis. So here's the thing. I'm going to beg you to listen to me for at least a couple of minutes because I want you to think through a crisis that might happen in the life of your church. Now, in the 14 years that I've been blessed to be in the position I'm in today, I've watched churches go through all kinds of crises. I've watched them go through an incompetence crisis. I've watched them go through a character crisis. I've watched them go through a financial crisis. Obviously, we all went through the pandemic, and that was a bit of a crisis of its own, right? And so what we all know about a crisis is that they're never announced ahead of time. We never get this email or a text that says, hey, by the way, next Wednesday, a crisis is going to come your way and you're going to have to navigate it. Never happens. It always comes out of the blue. And what is so incredibly important is that we actually think through ahead of time, well, how do I want to respond when that crisis comes? So what I want to do is I just want to give you a few things that I hope will help you navigate a church crisis, which I hope you never have, but chances are we're all going to have at some point. How do we navigate that in a way that is helpful? And again, we don't want our response to actually add more difficulty or more pain to the overall process. So let me give you a few ideas here. Number one, develop a crisis response plan. Most churches don't have one. They don't feel the need for one until they need it. And then they realize, oh my goodness, I wish we would have thought ahead of time. If I was really honest with you, what I would say is in the 14 years that I've been in this position, and I've had to handle a lot of different church crises. Matter of fact, my colleagues look at me and say, Chris, how come they tend to happen in the GOR? And I say, I don't know, I must be part of the problem. But I've had to navigate a lot of them. And what I found is that no church I've ever worked with ever had a crisis plan going into a crisis. And I have to tell you, even as the organization that I'm blessed to serve, the Great Lakes region, we didn't have one either. And then this last summer when I went off on sabbatical, all of a sudden I was in sabbatical about 5 or 6 days when the region went through a crisis in one of our churches. And we didn't have a crisis response plan either as a region. Now I tell you, we do today. And the reason we do is because we learned that we need one. Think through those processes. And if you say, okay, well, what needs to be part of a crisis response plan? Well, number two, let me give you an idea. As soon as we become aware that there's a crisis in our church, for instance, I had a dear pastor call me and say, we've had someone in our church confess to something that happened years ago, and it involved children. And as a result of that, it's going to hit the news, and here we go. Well, as soon as a Spirit-Anointed leader finds themselves in that kind of situation, I want to encourage you that our first response should actually be prayer. Begin from that moment. The moment that you hear that you're going into a crisis, start by praying. The more you can stay in connection with Holy Spirit as a Spirit-Anointed leader, the better off you're going to be. So make sure that you stay connected to Holy Spirit through the entire situation, but start by responding with prayer. And be honest. Pray prayers like, Holy Spirit, I don't have a clue how I should be responding right now. I'm not exactly sure how to navigate everything, but you've promised that if I lack wisdom, that you'll give me wisdom. So I'm asking you right now, Holy Spirit, please give me wisdom. Third thing, so first, develop a plan. Second, pray. Third, resist the temptation to increase your speed. In other words, force yourself to slow down when a crisis happens. I find that so many crisis missteps or mishaps or downright fumbles, like when we really fumble the ball in the midst of a crisis, is because people are responding too quickly. I've certainly had that tendency. We feel the tendency to have to respond right away. Now, the truth of the matter is what we really need to do in the midst of a crisis is to stay calm and to be slow in our response. Within reason, people will prefer a wise, thought-out response rather than a quick one. Yes, again, there's timing that we need to be aware of. We need to make a statement. Of course we do. Or we need to respond. Of course we need to respond. But we don't need to make a knee-jerk response. And all too often, our response ends up hurting the situation even more because we didn't slow down and think through our response. So, have a plan, pray, slow down. Number 4, get the right people on the bus helping you navigate the situation. Stop believing the lie when you're tempted to believe it, that you have to be an expert about everything you're about to navigate. You simply cannot be a legal expert, an HR expert, an insurance expert, a psychologist, a financial expert. We can't be all of those experts at once. We just can't. What we can do is get the right people on the bus to help us. Man, I've just learned through the years to quote unquote call a friend, to call an HR lawyer and get their input on something, to call a psychologist to get their input. Through the years, I've just learned it's so much smarter. Instead of me pretending that I know everything, I want to reach out to people who actually can help me navigate the situation. Sometimes we need to get the police involved if something illegal has happened. Often we need to get our board involved. If our church happens to be within the Great Lakes region, I would encourage you to give us a call because we want to help you through that process. Maybe we have to get the RBMD involved. Those people who work at ministerial development. I've learned through the years that I don't want to try and handle the situation on my own. I want there to be sometimes a very small, but a very capable group of individuals that help me navigate and discern how we should be responding. So, just gonna review number 1. Develop a crisis plan. Begin by praying. Resist the temptation to go fast. In other words, slow up your speed. Get the right people on the bus helping you. And number 5, get all the facts that you can. When a crisis happens, there's an investigation period that needs to begin. I've just learned that. No matter how clear a situation may be, never assume that you have all the facts until you've talked to all sides of a situation. Proverbs 18:17 says that one side seems right until you've heard the other side. Make sure that you slow up the process enough until you can hear all sides. I remember so clearly, we're going to put 2 pieces together here, the piece of not rushing and the piece of getting all the information. I remember very clearly, it was a Thursday night when I got a phone call about a crisis in one of our churches. And as it would turn out, I was going to have to go public with that crisis on that Sunday morning. The problem was that I was traveling, I was out of town, and I never had the opportunity to interview both sides before that Sunday. Now, ultimately, it worked out okay, but I would have handled that situation so much better if I would have taken the time to sit down with both sides. So, if there are 2 sides, if there's a possibility of another side, make sure you get the other side of the story before you go public. Number 6, communicate as clearly and as openly as possible to those who need to know. If you're dealing with a crisis that involves an individual, then it's so important to think through all aspects of communication. That is just so key in our world today. The communication circle, in other words, the people that we need to communicate to, is dependent on several factors. Number 1, what did the individual do, or what is the crisis that you're navigating right now? How large is the church? If it's a ministry leader within a large church, but that ministry is fairly small or fairly compact, then I would recommend dealing with that ministry. For instance, let's say that you have someone in a youth ministry and they have sent inappropriate texts to someone of the opposite sex or the same sex. At that point, the wisest thing to do is to begin by communicating to the parents. After you've done the investigation, after you've slowed down, after you've sought counsel, all that, but begin by the people in that ministry. And then you discern, do we need to go wider than that? For instance, if it was a worship leader at the church and perhaps something that they had done was going to hit the news, well, then obviously we need to respond differently than that. We have to have the wisdom to respond differently. Here's my rule of thumb that I practice these days. The scope of their ministry influence determines the scope of our communication. The scope of their ministry influence determines the scope of the communication. The next question we need to ask is, how do we share? See, in today's world, where people are convinced that a church is always trying to cover up something that happened, we probably have to disclose more than we did 10 or 15 years ago. 10 years ago, I would have done my best to make sure I was holding the person fully accountable for whatever it is that they did, including taking steps of church discipline. But I probably, in some cases, would have saved the congregation from having to know all the details because I was trying to save the person's future career. Today, in today's world, I have to be committed to making sure that we're finding that fine line between not doing something that would indicate that we're hiding anything, while at the same time being careful not to open up the church or the organization for a lawsuit from that person who's involved in the situation. This is another place where we need great wisdom and discernment and counsel. Me personally, we have a lawyer within the GLR, and I call that person. I ask them for wisdom and discernment. I don't want to navigate this alone. I want the letters that I write to be checked with a lawyer so often when it comes to this kind of thing because I want their insight. Next one, number 7, minister to all the parties whenever possible. If there are victims in this situation, do your best to minister to them. Do your best to reach out and say, we want to be here for you. How can we help you? Sometimes and oftentimes this can include the spouse of the person involved. Often they're the silent victim in it all. And so we want to do our best to not just reach out to the person who's involved in whatever they've done and to their victims, depending on who they are. We want to reach out to them and love on them and try and support them with counseling if we can, that kind of thing. But we also want to check in on the spouse of the person involved and make sure that we're doing our best to minister to that individual as well. Finally, ask God to help you find that perfect blend of grace and truth. Being strong, but speaking in love. Not saying too much, but not saying too little. So, in summary, come up with a church crisis plan. I'm begging you to do that before it happens. And if you want a copy of ours, write us. We'll be glad to give it to you. Number 2, when you become aware of a crisis, pray. Let your first response be to go to the Father and keep going back to Him through the power of Holy Spirit and asking Him for wisdom. Number 3, resist the temptation to speed up. Slow down, take it slowly. Again, asking for wisdom, getting the wisdom from God that we need so that we don't make the problem worse by our response. Number 4, get the right people on the bus. Get your advisors helping you. Again, lawyers, financial experts, HR experts, insurance experts, a psychologist, that kind of thing. Get the right people helping you. Number 5, get all the facts. Don't just listen to one side, make sure you listen to both. Communicate. Number 6, communicate as clearly and as openly as possible to those who need to know. It'd just be so helpful to think through a communication plan and think through it thoroughly and make sure that the people that need to know find out. Number 7, minister to all the parties, the victims, the individual and the individual spouse, and children, whoever might be involved. And finally, Ask God to help you find the perfect blend of grace and truth. The last thing, once the crisis is over, ask yourself a question. Do you need an extra break? You, the leader, the pastor, whatever your position is, a board member, an executive pastor, do you need an extra break? What I find is that crises can be really draining for us. And once we get past the crisis, sometimes those of us who are navigating the crisis, we need some time off and to say, man, that just drained a whole lot out of me. I now need to go get my bearings and just allow the Holy Spirit to minister to me and to my spirit and my heart. So make sure that you take care of yourself, both through the crisis and once the crisis is over. Make sure that you monitor your own tanks. How are they? Your emotional tank, your spiritual tank, your relational tanks. Make sure that you don't allow the crisis to suck everything out of you, but that you replenish. And when it's over, take some extra time for replenishment. Hey, thanks so much. Again, I hope you never go through a crisis, but when you do, I pray that you'll respond in a Spirit-anointed manner. Do me a favor, warrior, would you subscribe? Would you share this podcast and follow us? That would be a huge help. And our heart is that we'll go out as Spirit-anointed leaders and that the crisis that we face will not impact the mission that we're on to see as many people come into a relationship with Jesus Christ as possible because we handle the crisis well. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. I'll see you next Monday.